Illinois lawmakers are heading into the final sprint of the 2025 session with one critical task ahead of them: passing a budget in the face of tightening revenues. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, May 23rd, 2025, and this is Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Cast. I'm Peter Hancock, and I'm here this week with my colleague Ben Szalinski and our editor-in-chief, Jerry Nowicki. Guys, thanks for being here.
Hello, Peter.
Hey, Peter.
So we're heading into a 3-day Memorial Day weekend, and then comes the final stretch of the session, leading up to Saturday the 31st, which is kind of a constitutional deadline to get all of their work done. They can go past that date, but after the 31st, things start getting a little more complicated. There are actually a lot of issues that need to be dealt with in that time, but let's start with the budget, the big one. We've been talking about this all session, about how this is a tough budget year with slow revenue growth and increasing demand for spending on things like education, pensions, and a host of other things. Jerry, can you give us like the 30,000-foot level view? What does the budget look like as we sit here right now?
Yeah, it was already a tough budget year given in a vacuum of any drastic federal changes. And then here we are this week talking about, what we're going to discuss later, this major congressional bill. So the long story short of it is it reminds me a lot of 2020. We were sitting here, they came back during the pandemic, they didn't know what was going to happen, what type of federal aid was going to pass, what type of drastic changes to the economy were going to be seen. And they just quickly passed a budget, giving the governor quite a bit of authority to move things around. I'm not saying I necessarily expect the same thing here, but what I am saying is there's the same feeling of, well, anything could happen as we enter the final week.
Yeah, and even without all of the federal questions hanging over everybody's head, and we'll get to those in a minute because they are substantial, just looking at the budget without all of that, it was going to be a tough year. Revenues have been flattening out. Every year we're supposed to increase spending on K through 12 education. We're supposed to increase pension contributions. So there are a lot of demands on general revenue. What we're looking at, somewhere around a $55 billion budget that the governor proposed back in February.
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing is there's, like you said, there are so many things just sort of statutorily, the statutory language creates these upward budget pressures. And I think, Ben, and you wrote in your story today that there was only about 1% growth in the sort of discretionary type spending within the budget. So that's not a lot. I mean, obviously, that's not the pace of inflation year over year. So a lot of, just keeping funding flat essentially amounts to cuts just with the way expenses have grown.
And the governor had kind of put out the message early on that if lawmakers want to add anything, he started off saying this is not the year to start new programs, but if you want to add anything, you have to come up with some offsetting cuts somewhere else, or you have to come up with additional revenues.
And the legislative leaders, both on our Illinois lawmakers program in the last 2 weeks, have essentially said the same thing. Senate President Harman and Speaker Chris Welch have both said, we got to cut if we want to increase spending.
Okay, and so there has been actually very little progress, at least from what we've been able to see on the outside so far this session, about what's going to go into the budget, what cuts are going to be made. Ben, can you talk a little bit? The Republicans had, or their leadership had a news conference this week where they were criticizing the Democratic majority, saying that the budget problems are all the result of big spending increases under the Pritzker administration. Let's listen to what House Minority Leader Tony McCombie said in that news conference this week.
It's not going to be easy. This isn't easy. And we're not saying that the budget is going to be easy to put together. I think the governor, I know the governor in our first conversations before the budget address, when we sat down together, he wasn't celebrating. He knew that this was going to be a tough year, and it's going to continue to get tough as we go forward.
So you and I were both in that news conference, and it was kind of striking how I thought they were talking about we need to have structural changes, we need to have long-term solutions, which is probably true, but not a lot of talk about what we need to do this year to balance this budget. Did you hear anything along those lines?
No, not really at all. Their long-held criticism on the Republican side of the aisle is that Democrats have simply just increased spending too quickly. They're spending unnecessary money has been the argument, but the main thing they always resort back to when they talk about needing to cut some sort of spending is always cutting health care and other programs for undocumented people in the state of Illinois. The governor's actually done that partially in this budget. He's introduced a $300 million cut to immigrant health care programs. So, absent that, we don't really hear a lot of, specifics from Republicans. We heard the Freedom Caucus a few weeks ago say that they need to, reevaluate a lot of grant funding that goes to nonprofit organizations, but some of that is not even inside the general revenue spending. So, it's still kind of unclear exactly what Republicans think we need to do to actually, reduce spending in this state. But they point to a lot of structural reforms that, Illinois has long had issues with on pensions and other areas like that.
Okay, and so it was in the midst of all of this that Congress and the Trump administration really kind of threw us a curveball this week, as they have been prone to do for the last few months. The U.S. House passed what is called a budget reconciliation bill, what President Trump and his allies have called the Big Beautiful Bill, that enacts much of Donald Trump's domestic agenda. There are steep cuts in federal spending on things like health care, education, clean energy incentives, and a lot of other programs. Increased spending for the military and border security, and a whole package of tax cuts. And I thought one of the things this brings to light is how heavily dependent state governments are on revenues that flow to them from the federal government. Let's listen to what Senate President Don Harmon said to our colleague Jack Titchener on the TV program Illinois Lawmakers this week.
It's not unique to Illinois. There's no state in the union that could survive the sorts of cuts they're proposing to health care for working families. That said, you can't predict the unpredictable. We're going to pass a responsible, balanced budget with the information we have today, and we'll deal with the future in the future.
Okay, so Ben, let's talk a little bit about some of the ways that this congressional bill affects the state budget. I guess one of the biggest ones is Medicaid, which is this huge state and federal program. Is probably one of the biggest revenue-sharing programs where the federal government sends money down to the states to pay for the health care of lower-income people. Big changes in that program, especially for what's called the expansion group under the Affordable Care Act. These are working age adults whose incomes are at or below 138% of the poverty level. We have more than 750,000 people in Illinois covered under that ACA expansion. The bill would reduce the amount of federal reimbursement that states receive for that group, but any reduction conceivably could trigger an automatic cessation of that whole program in Illinois. We have what's called a trigger law that says if the federal government ever reduces the amount of reimbursement, which is currently 90% of the cost, that program automatically goes away. So we're potentially looking at all of those people losing their health care. There are things like requirements for work requirements for that expansion group of people, requirements that they verify their eligibility twice a year instead of once a year, which presumably would result in a lot more people falling off the rolls, either because they no longer qualify or they just simply don't fill out the paperwork. And there's really not yet any way to quantify exactly how big of an impact those things would have on Illinois, although presumably they would be huge. You looked at some of the other ways that the congressional bill would affect Illinois, in addition to Medicaid. What else is in there?
Yeah, there's so many different things. We could be here forever kind of listing off all the ways it could impact the state. Continuing on the healthcare front, the federal bill would end Medicaid coverage for abortion, gender-affirming care, and many programs. So that's just one area where state lawmakers would potentially have to foot the bill for increased healthcare costs in order to continue providing those services, which we know Illinois Democrats are in favor of. So that could be something they consider, but finding the money to foot that big bill is going to be very challenging. Outside of that, one example is the SNAP program that many low-income people depend on for food assistance. And
that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, more commonly known as food stamps.
Yeah, and under the changes that Congress is considering making to that program, the state would be responsible for covering 5% of benefits costs. Currently, the state doesn't cover any of the benefits costs. It also only covers 50% of administrative costs, but Congress wants the state to cover 75% of administrative costs. So that's just kind of one area where this bill is going to be potentially imposing a new requirement on the Illinois budget, whether the state likes it or not. It's going to have to comply with that, and that's going to divert money from other priorities, especially if there's not going to be new revenue coming to the state. And one area that the state really believes is important to continue spending money on is clean energy. The federal government wants to cut off some pretty important tax incentives for clean energy projects, for nuclear energy projects, which the state of Illinois is nowhere near close to starting right now. So that's just more costs that if the state is going to continue to move towards this 2045 carbon-free goal, it's going to have to pick up for itself. Otherwise, there's just a growing risk of not meeting that legally required goal.
Okay, and you're referring back to a massive clean energy bill that the General Assembly passed a number of years ago that was sort of predicated in part on a lot of federal incentives that were being provided at that time to incentivize the shift toward renewable energy or zero carbon energy. But now under the Trump administration, those are about to go away, or they're being proposed to be eliminated. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. The big, beautiful bill, it calls for eliminating tax incentives for clean energy programs, really almost immediately in some circumstances, or if the project is completed after 2028. When it comes to nuclear energy, if the project hasn't started by 2028, then the tax credit from the federal government goes away under this bill. So Illinois is not going to be building any new nuclear reactors more than likely in the next 4 years here. Certainly don't expect it. Really, a lot of experts say within the next 10 years because it's a very, very long federal permitting process. So, this is kind of just House congressional Republicans' way of clamping down on what they view as the Green New Deal. They're very opposed to a lot of these clean energy sources, but the state, especially under the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed under President Joe Biden, has really tapped into a lot of these federal sources to kind of boost these projects that are helping the state meet clean energy goals. So, losing the funding for that really just kind of sets Illinois back and puts more pressure on state lawmakers to increase spending in this area in order to meet these goals.
Okay, and so this federal legislation that we've been talking about, it has just passed the U.S. House, hasn't yet been considered in the Senate. That could take a number of weeks, we presume. So it could be later this summer, assuming that it may have to go to a conference committee before we get a final package that would be sent to the president. By that time, of course, the legislature has to pass its budget for the state next week. So what are the chances that this thing could be passed, later in the summer, have a dramatic impact on the state budget, and then would lawmakers have to come back in the summer or early fall to deal with the fallout from that?
It's certainly possible, and that's something that we've actually openly heard Democrat leadership, including the governor, float, which I think is a pretty good indication that they are potentially considering kind of what Jerry was talking about, something along the lines of, we're going to pass a budget to the best of our knowledge with the information we have today. And as you heard the Senate president say in that comment, we'll deal with the future in the future. When that future is, whether that's this year or just a future budget cycle for the state, that remains to be seen. Representative Ryan Spain at the news conference yesterday made a good observation that a lot of these major changes don't take effect for a few years, especially on the Medicaid front. But what lawmakers are going to need to evaluate is which changes actually are taking effect right away, potentially this summer or later in this calendar year, and do they need to come back and find either new revenue to fill these new mandates from Congress, or potentially just reevaluate the revenue coming into the state altogether and how that affects the rest of the state's spending plan?
Okay, and so while we're looking ahead to next week and watching for what happens with the budget, there are still a number of other non-budgetary issues hanging out there that lawmakers are expected to deal with in the final week. I'm looking in particular at Governor Pritzker's proposal that he made during his initial budget address in February to allow community colleges to offer four-year degree programs in certain high-demand fields in their local communities. That has hit something of a roadblock in the legislature. It stalled at about the midpoint of the session, but here this past week, a new amendment has surfaced in the House, and it may be coming back to life in the final week, so we'll watch what happens with that. Ben, what are you watching for?
Public transportation reform in the Chicago area and downstate's obviously been one of the big ticket legislative items this spring. And we're really not all that more clear on what's going to happen with that than we were last week or just a few weeks ago. We know that lawmakers are pretty close to an agreement on how they're going to reform governing structures for the Chicago area public transit agencies, but how funding a $771 million gap just in 2026 alone is going to happen, we don't really have any answers to that. We've heard kind of varying opinions that, potentially that some of these big things like a statewide service tax would be on the table, but a lot of lawmakers seem pretty leery to adopt something that would be viewed as just a straight up tax hike on the people of Illinois. So we're hearing maybe some potentially smaller things targeting people who, are choosing to commute in their cars to work rather than, taking the train, for example. But how this is ultimately going to funded in the short term is unclear, but even long term, this is unclear because the gap doesn't go away. And then downstate public transit agencies also face a growing funding shortfall in the coming years for different reasons. So, there's a lot of reform that needs to take place across the board here in the state, but lawmakers with such a tight budget year, where are they going to find money to cover a multi-$100 million gap is, very unclear. And, they're not really interested in raising taxes, at least for many of them.
And Jerry, what do you have on your radar screen going into the final week?
Yeah, I think our colleague Andrew Adams did a real thorough report on the state of electric grid policy in Illinois, or energy policy more broadly. He sort of broke down the fact that we're going to see price spikes on consumer bills in the Ameren and ComEd territory, which is, millions of Illinoisans will see their prices go up, and he sort of breaks down why that is, the fact that they're having trouble getting renewable energy on the grid, and fossil fuel plants are going offline in the multi-state grid areas. So just generally speaking, lawmakers are trying to figure out how to address the root causes of some of this, and they're going to maybe sit down and come up with a bill by May 31st. And as you guys were talking about, they're also sort of contemplating what the federal legislation would mean for this, and if it could even make it harder to get renewables on the grid, which is sort of what Illinois is relying upon to sort of stave off some of these price spikes moving forward.
Okay, and just a reminder that those and other stories about what's going on at the State House can be found at our website, capitalnewsillinois.com. In the meantime, that will do it for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation with significant funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, this is Peter Hancock with Jerry Nowicki and Ben Szalinski on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team saying thank you for listening.